Good morning and welcome to True Talk. This is your host, Samar Jarrah. My co-host is taking the month off, so you're going to be just listening to me. We are going to have a very, very interesting show today. We're going to be talking to Masoud Hayyoun. He is an American Arab Jew, and he is the author, When We Were Arabs, A Jewish Family's Forgotten History. It's a fascinating book that I just finished reading, and I can't wait to talk to Masoud. So I asked Masoud to send me songs to play today. So he sent me this song that I have listened to several times. It's by Lili Bonishi. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. He is Algerian, also Jewish. And the song is Ana fil Hub. I had no idea when I was listening to this song that this beautiful, amazing love song was by an Algerian Jew. This is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. If you are on Twitter, you can follow us there live. This is the song Fil Hub. The gentleman is saying, this is my story in love. Maybe Masoud can explain to us. Good morning, Masoud. Are you there?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you.
It's my pleasure, Masoud. It is always wonderful to read a book and then to be able to talk to the author and ask all the questions that we as readers would love to ask you, because I know that no matter what, there are more things that you would love to talk about, but the books are limited. Let me just introduce you, Masoud, again to our listeners. This is Masoud Hayyoun. He's a journalist based in Los Angeles. He has reported for Al Jazeera English, Pacific Standard, Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown Online, The Atlantic, Agence France Presse, and the South China Morning Post. He speaks and works in 5 languages. And you won the 2015 EPI Award. I'm suspecting you speak English, French, Arabic, Hebrew. What else?
None of those languages fluently, I'm going to be honest. Not a single one.
Okay.
Just a shakshuka of all of the above, basically.
But you do know salam, shalom, peace, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to tell our listeners that this is the book, When We Were Arabs, a Jewish Family's Forgotten History. Of course, I, who grew up in the Arab world, I knew later, in my later years, I think when I lived in Egypt, Masoud, that there were and there are Egyptian Jews, and they still live there. And when I was much older, a few, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, I was able to visit the synagogue in Egypt, which is a beautiful, beautiful synagogue. And the lady who is responsible, I think, is a female. But I want to ask you, Masoud, why did you write this book? We are used in the West to know that, Arabs are only Muslims, and there is a small persecuted minority of Christians. And there was some period of time Jews, but the Arabs kicked them out. So why did you write this book?
For so many reasons. It became impressed upon me and my grandmother, who is like a co-author on this book. First, I should say that my grandmother raised me sort of as a mother to me. Mm-hmm. And it was really the 2014 offensive on Gaza, on the Palestinian people, that impressed upon us the need to say these things that we had felt for some time publicly. So there are some people who kind of responded to this book before reading it, thinking that it was just an exploration of a novel kind of group of people who you don't often hear about, and how interesting and curious it is that there are people who sit at the nexus of both Arabness and Judaism. That's not what it is. Honestly, for me to claim Arabness in the way that other people would have liked to have seen me do it, in the way where I say we had a belly dancer at my bar mitzvah, we listened to Arabic music, we on occasion prayed Jewish prayers to the tune of songs from the classic era of Egyptian cinema. That kind of stuff is not really significant to me so much as the political prescience of identifying or being in solidarity with people who the world expects me to be hateful toward. That, to me, is a powerful enterprise. So I am interested, obviously, in our cultural legacy and the fact that for Shabbat on Saturday mornings we ate fundemis, and that we loved Arabic music, and that at any of our bar mitzvahs, weddings, etc., it was always Arabic music and dance, and the Arabic language was one that I grew up listening to, the kind of colloquial North African Arabics that were in my home. But this isn't about language or food or music or the novelty of me existing so much as it is to say the groups of people that you think exist, that need to exist for the people in power to continue to kill and oppress people, they don't exist in the way that you think that they exist. We need to reconfigure the entire world. If you think that an Arab and a Jew are two mutually exclusive, hard-set black and white, blood-based categories, you're wrong. And your failure to understand the nuance that is humanity is actively killing people in Palestine and elsewhere in the Arab world, insofar as the movement for Palestinian liberation is a microcosm, not a microcosm, is a centerpiece of the movement for Arab, and I would say by extension of that, human liberation more broadly.
I'm going to be talking about all the politics of the book towards maybe the second half of the show, Masood, and our listeners. You can always send us to dj@wmnf.org if you have any questions. I'm not sure if we're going to be opening the phone lines. Maybe we will. But this is a very interesting conversation that we're going to have with Masood. So please, if you have any questions, send them to dj@wmnf.org. And again, we are live on Twitter if you want to follow through my handle name, which is Samar D. Jarrah. Before we go into these details, Masood, I want the listeners to understand when, like, you're talking about, it's not about culture, it's not about music, it's not about only that, but it's more deeper, and we will get to this. But they need to understand, for instance, the major hero of this book, or the major character, or the central figure in your life too, as a human being, which is Oscar. So can you tell us a little bit about who Oscar is, and how did he live in Egypt before everything started to go sour?
Absolutely. So Oscar Hayoun was my grandfather who raised me in Los Angeles as the only father that I ever had. And he, first it's important to say that he died when I was 16 years old, and that death sort of began the life that I live now, forever in search of him everywhere. Mm-hmm. So that was why I ended up going back to the Arab world to find the essence of him. Mm-hmm. And that was why I decided to explore more of what his life had been. And he was born in Egypt, in Alexandria, at a time of cosmopolitanism, yes, but there were also a number. It was a British protectorate. Egyptians were second-class citizens within their own country. It was also a time of, I don't really want to use the word tolerance, but religious acceptance of people of every faith in the Arab world kind of coming together and configuring an Arabist future. So he was raised in a very Europeanized, colonized Alexandria, where Jewish Egyptians existed without question. There were a great many Jewish Egyptians who were very prominent in government, in music, in film, who were very patriotic for the cause of Egyptian and, by extension of that, Arab liberation at the time, particularly among the more socialist elements of that society that he lived in. My grandfather left me 3 handwritten autobiographies in Costco notebooks, or it was Price Club back then. And they endeavored to tell his life, and I never read them just out of laziness. And for the purpose of this book, I started reading them, and I always assumed that they would be kind of divided up very evenly between his life in Egypt in the first one, his life in France and occupied Palestine in the second one, and then his life in the United States in the third one. The thing is, there was no life described after Egypt, after he left in his early 30s, which is how old I am now. Wow. His life ended when he left Egypt. And he left Egypt because of the changes of 1948, because various imperialist powers made it impossible for our community to continue to live in the Arab world. So that's to say that my grandfather continued to live in Egypt and in Alexandria of the mind until he died in his 80s in Los Angeles, and I was raised in that home. I was raised in a home that fed itself on recollections of what that Egypt and that Arab world, because my grandfather was partially of Moroccan origin. There were a lot of people from all over the Arab world and even the southern Mediterranean and Britain, of course, who were living in Egypt at the time. Our home was a kind of an Egypt of the mind. And I'll continue to live in that Egypt of the mind, mourning him after his death.
If you're just joining us, this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM, and I'm talking to Masoud Hayoun, who is the author of When We Were Arabs, A Jewish Family's Forgotten History, a fascinating book that I encourage you to read it. Actually, Masoud, I had the double advantage of downloading the book on my iPad, and I was listening to you reading it, so it's different when the author is reading his own book. So your grandfather, you mentioned, lived as a second-class citizen. Was he treated as such by the fellow Egyptians, Muslims or Christians, or you are talking about the British mandate over Egypt at that time? And what do you mean by a second-class citizen?
I mean that he was a second-class citizen in the sense that all indigenous peoples under colonialism in the Arab world were treated as second-class citizens with regards to the European intruders.
Okay, so we just want to make clear that it wasn't like the Egyptian Muslims, for instance, will shun them and not invite them to their homes or any of that. It was the whole mandate system.
Absolutely not, vis-a-vis other Egyptian people who considered Oscar to be Egyptian, even though he was part Moroccan. There was a system that legally and socially otherized indigenous people within their own ancestral homeland. And it's such an important point that you raise that it's sad to me that I need to specify that it wasn't Egyptian people who were persecuting my family at that time, because the running narrative is that our entire history within the Arab world since time immemorial was just a history of a continuous persecution and violence. That's not to say that our communities, that religious minorities and ethnic minorities or what have you within the context of the Arab world didn't face awful oppression and violence. It's to say that that is a particular historical narrative that's pushed by people who want to continue to assail the Arab world, and that a more nuanced picture of the history of the Arab world shows that that's short-sighted, because really every single group within the Arab world, to include many Muslims, to include any kind of political dissidents, had problems with accountable government, as was the case in the West in different ways. And yet somehow at the onset of colonialism in our world, the West seemed to posit itself as a kind of beacon of progressivism and support to minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and to women. One of the inspiring kind of icons for this book was Nawal al-Saadawi from Egypt, the Egyptian feminist, who in her preface to The Hidden Face of Eve, which is an important Arab feminist treatise, says, even though this book is being translated into English, I want you, and she's writing to, in particular, Western feminists, not believe that this is an excuse for you to intervene in our world or to further a Western colonial footprint in our world. For me, writing about our people in the English language, because I can't write about our people in the Arab language, and that is to say the Arab peoples, it was a dangerous thing to do, because there are so many people who want to weaponize any experience my family had with discrimination or violence against my people, against the Arab peoples. I have to put my foot down, and I appreciate the opportunity on this show to say ours was not a history of constant sorrow and discrimination and violence. We were there at the beginning of people beginning to identify as Arab. I continue in my identification with an Arab cultural and ethnic and historical legacy to be a part of the building of and the defense of and the liberation of the Arab peoples. That's important to know.
So I want to know, Masoud, and again to our listeners, this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. We're talking to Masoud Hayoun. He's the author of the wonderful book, When We Were Arabs, A Jewish Family's Forgotten History. So are there like concrete steps that the British took in Egypt where they divorce the Jewish Arab from the rest of the Arabs or from the homeland where your grandfather had to leave?
There was...
Yeah, go ahead. Can you give me examples of what concrete steps they took?
Really, there was, at the time in the Arab world of the beginning of the latest European intrusion that affected my grandparents' generation, it was a French school system that was popular across the Arab world called the Alliance Israélite schools that began to teach students in their schools that they were not part of their home societies, that they were not part of their indigenous communities, but that they were part of a Jewish nation that existed transnationally. And this idea of a Jewish nation that existed transnationally was not one that was intuitive to the generations that came before my grandparents. That French school system existed in Egypt at a time when France and Britain were both jockeying for power before the British formalized their protectorate over Egypt. Then after the British took power in Egypt, the French school system was still heavily entrenched and began to re-Arabize, de-Arabized populations, if that makes sense. It's a bit confusing.
So Arabize, Masoud, Arabize, for instance, Egyptian Muslims, but not Jewish Egyptians?
No, it's such a kind of convoluted imperialist machination that I should begin again. Okay. This was a Jewish school system set up by the French colonial power before the British formalized their mandate over Egypt, and it existed across the Arab world. The original purpose of this school system was to de-Arabize the elites in Jewish Arab communities and let that de-Arabization trickle down.
Okay.
So at a time when France had anticipated that they would be colonizing Egypt, not the British, they de-Arabized the Jewish Egyptian communities. They reversed that policy around the time of my grandfather's generation to Arabize them. And there are specific specific curricula, specific documents saying we want to reintegrate into mainstream, that is to say, non-Jewish Arab society, these Jewish Egyptian communities. And the very clear, kind of very thinly veiled purpose behind re-Arabizing them only within the Egyptian British-dominated context was to promote that the Jewish Egyptians join movements together with Muslim and Christian Egyptians to throw off an Egyptian protectorate so that France could swoop in and further its footprint in the Arab world. And this had a lasting effect on how both Oscar and Daida were. Daida being my grandmother. Daida was part of a community that was effectively de-Arabized. My grandmother spoke a colloquial Tunisian Arabic, but didn't know how to write it, didn't know how to read in Arabic. Identified less with she watched a lot of Arabic movies, but always identified more with France being the center of civilization. And then Oscar, where it was a policy of the colonial school systems to re-Arabize, was fluent in Arabic, on his spare time would translate books from Arabic to English for me to read them from the library. These were things that seemed like natural parts of their personality when I was growing up, but that were actually decided for us by people across the Mediterranean in Paris and London. Yes.
So the Egypt ended up under the British. Yes. So what happened to your grandfather towards the last years of hers living in Egypt?
My grandfather ended up volunteering for the British war effort. At the time, really venerating the British in the kind of strange way that people with colonial mentalities end up half venerating and half resenting the people that they're considered to be secondary to. For example, I lived in Hong Kong for a period of time, and there were a lot of people who would describe this kind of strange feeling toward Britishness, that they resented the fact that under the British, there were huge swaths of Hong Kong and central district, for example, where if you were of Chinese ethnicity, you could only go there if you were a maid or a cook or a working class person. That was the same view that my grandfather had of the British, was that he wrote in his journals that he was looked down upon by these people who he was volunteering for some reason and working for unpaid for their war effort, because they had transplanted what was a fundamentally European conflict onto Egyptian soil. And at the same time, he venerated everything about them. He loved British films, British products, because the British had made themselves out to be a center of civilization and progress.
Wow. It is so similar, Masoud, to what is going on and was going on and still is going on in the Arab world. I know that you eventually visited the Arab world, but like in Egypt and, for instance, in many Gulf countries, in Jordan, you were an upper class if you sent your kids to English schools. And now we have a generation that my nieces and nephews cannot read my Arabic books. They can converse with me in Arabic, but their compass is in the West. Maybe America more than Britain, but for them, yeah, it's both, the two English languages. So this colonization has not stopped. It just changed gears, or at least these schools are still there. I want to shift to how he left and where did he go to and how he ended up in Palestine. And maybe what you can do is read an excerpt about him when he went to Palestine and found out he is dealing with stolen goods and lands.
Mm-hmm. Would you like me to read that?
Yeah.
I have.
Yes.
Sure.
So he left Egypt to France or to Palestine?
It was the case that at the time that my family left around 1950, that you weren't allowed to go directly from Egypt to occupied Palestine, but that you could go through France.
Okay.
And there were kind of operatives who helped our family transition from a camp in southern France to Haifa.
Okay. Can you read them? Yeah.
Yes. The Hayuns were living in a tent city, that is in occupied Palestine, about an hour and a half south of Haifa by bus, in a place called Bir Yaakov. They ate rationed food and awaited relocation to more permanent dwellings. Imagine me having nothing to do after a busy life in Egypt. It was not a life in this place, Oscar wrote. I used to roam around the villages in the company of a younger boy looking for citrus groves, picking sweet lemons and oranges. All the groves were owned by Arabs who had fled. These were ghost towns pillaged and still unsettled by the invaders. The Palestinians who had grown those fruits either slaughtered or made homeless before their harvest.
So your father couldn't stay in occupied Palestine?
He found no place for himself in the context of this society that had been envisioned as a kind of a European bastion in the East, on the ash heap of Palestinian civilization.
So what did he think of Zionism? Did he talk to you about it, or did he write about it in his memoirs or the papers that he left you?
Zionism as an ideology, my grandfather didn't really seem to... Oscar was not a political person, and he was an apolitical person out of fear, I think, more than anything else. And I think that was because when he left Egypt, the Egyptian government for a long time around the onset of Zionism was good about differentiating between Jewish Egyptians and Zionists. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point in time, and already by the time that Oscar and his family left, they dissolved the Egyptian citizenship of the Jews who left. So that seemed to be a kind of trauma for Oscar. He didn't believe that citizenship or nationality or belonging in a place is something that can't be very easily dissolved for someone. So, for example, when the United States invaded Iraq, I was in high school and I went to a lot of protests at the time, and it was probably the first time that I ever went to a protest, were anti-war protests against the Iraq invasion. When I came home from those protests, Oscar was livid that I would involve myself in the politics of this country. And the implication was that my citizenship, even as somebody who was born in the United States, would be dissolved because he had his citizenship dissolved in a place where he never thought that would be possible. It's important to note at the same time that there were early Zionist operatives who had perpetrated terrorist attacks in Egypt that began to turn the local non-Jewish Egyptian population against Jewish Egyptians.
I think it is known as the Lavon affair. People can Google Lavon affair, where bandits would go and blow up, I think, like American centers, like educational centers, and seem to blame it on Jews and Egyptians. And wasn't it something like that?
Yes. Across the Arab world, not just in Egypt, in Baghdad, there were similar fire bombings. There were these incidents where local populations were being turned against Jewish populations actively without any concern for who would be targeted among local Jewish Arab populations. The point wasn't to uphold or preserve or protect Jewish lives within the Arab context. It was all in service of the occupation of Palestine. And it made it increasingly difficult for local administrations, for Arab administrations, to not view local Jewish communities with suspicion. That's not to say that my grandfather's citizenship should have been dissolved. It's to say that it seems to have been a very kind of cynical, calculated tactic of the Zionist operatives of this time to turn local populations against us, to make it impossible for us to continue to live in that context.
And hoping that they will go and populate occupied Palestine after driving the people. But which is weird, because once your grandfather Oscar landed in Palestine, they sprayed him with DDT. So these who were like Eastern Jews were not treated kindly, were they? And still are not, I guess.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that this isn't only something faced by Jewish Arabs. This is the DDT was sprayed on Eastern Jews, people who were considered Oriental Jews, the people who came from Russia and Eastern Europe, eventually, because of Eastern Europeans like Golda Meir, who ended up being in power. They ended up being part of the upper crust, but when they first arrived, they were considered to be Oriental and backward Jews and were sprayed down with DDT. The history of anti-Jewish behavior on the part of the early Israeli government is one that's shared by both European and non-European Jewish communities.
Just one colonial project with different names.
Exactly. The important point of this book, that one of the things that I had hoped to do with this book was to show that even though the Zionist movement was one that was slightly different from the French colonial and British colonial movement, in that it showed the local Jewish communities that occupied Palestine would be the center of their future universes, as opposed to France and London. In practice, it was a continuation of that legacy, because it divorced us from our home communities. We were no longer able to see ourselves as one people together with the rest of Tunisian, Moroccan, Egyptian people, we were taught that we were another people, where that didn't exist in our histories. For example, I talk about in Daida, my grandmother's community in Tunisia, there were several kind of very bitter divisions between Jewish communities that lived within the Tunisian context. There were people who came after the Spanish Inquisition, and there were people from Livorno, Italy, who the Tuensa, which is what we called ourselves, Tunisian Jewish people who had been there since time immemorial, considered not even to be real Jews because they resembled Europeans too much. Their practice of Judaism in our minds looked too much like Christianity to have been anything like our Judaism. Of course, I don't believe that. I believe that there are many ways of practicing Judaism. But it's to say that the idea that this European school system pushed of a transnational Jewish people that had always lived under oppression and that needed to return to an idea of biblical Canaan that exists in a spiritual and not really a physical realm for us was not one that was intuitive or natural to Oscar and Daida and the people before their generations. It's one that needed to be taught to them over a series of generations, and that there were very specific policy documents, first in the French and British colonies, and then in the Zionist occupation, the European Zionist occupation of Palestine, that wanted them to slowly forget over time, over generations, that we had ever had any competing identity with our faith.
Actually, Masoud, there is one French document that you mentioned. The name escapes me. Do you remember what it is? Maybe our listeners can Google it and see to what extent the French went into how much they played and created class and division among not only the Jewish people, but especially about the Jews of the Arab world. Do you remember the name of this? It escapes me in your book.
Absolutely. It's the Alteres Cohen document, the first Jewish French dignitaries to go to Algeria.
Alteres
Cohen report.
Okay.
And these were French dignitaries at the onset of the French occupation of Algeria, who went to Algeria to survey the local Jewish communities and see how Jewish Algerian communities, which were themselves very diverse, could be weaponized against the greater mass of Algerian people for the purpose of further colonizing them. This report said very specifically, they will forget that they were indigenous peoples over several generations, and they will then act as a kind of a go-between between the Western power and the colonized indigenous Muslim populations.
Wow.
And then it extrapolated from that to say, we're looking at furthering our footprint in other Arab communities and other Arab nations throughout the Arab world. And there are other important Jewish Arab communities there as well. They mentioned specifically Egypt, that they're looking at colonizing Egypt and that they could weaponize the very influential Jewish Egyptian communities in Alexandria, Cairo, Mansoura, to take over those communities. In Baghdad, they're looking at enlarging their footprint by taking the Jewish community and weaponizing them. It's important to note that at this time in French history, the Jewish French communities had themselves just been emancipated. They had a still shaky, unstable status within France of not being secondary French citizens themselves. So these dignitaries were envisioning a stronger role for France through colonialism, saying that Jewish French people can serve their nation and by weaponizing Jewish Arab communities against their indigenous compatriots.
Oh, God.
It's a very cynical document.
Yeah.
It's a document that actually says a lot to me about how my family ended up, because the thing is, my grandfather tried to teach me Arabic. I've tried to be around other Arab American people, but let's face it, a lot of the Arabness that existed in my grandparents' generation doesn't exist for me. It couldn't exist for me.
Wow.
I identify strongly with Arab liberation. I see myself as part of that whole, but I'll never speak Arabic as a native language. I'll never really understand certain things about the Arab world because people in Paris in the 1800s envisioned that every single generation in my family would become progressively less Arab. And by all accounts, it worked.
Wow.
Only I refuse. Yeah. And that's what this book is. It's a rejection of that erasure.
I hope the new generation in the Arab world would listen to you and read it and understand that living in the Arab world and not being able to read a book in Arabic is a disaster.
Astounding. Yeah.
It's colonized, and I think you mentioned that colonizing the brain. But I want just to remind our listener, Masoud, that this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM, and I am talking to Masoud Hayoun, who's a journalist based in Los Angeles, and he is the author of the wonderful book When We Were Arabs, A Jewish Family's Forgotten History. I encourage you to listen to it because Masoud reads it himself, and his pronunciation of singers and food and things that are Jewish is perfect. And I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about your grandmother. She is also part of your character and your upbringing, and she's co-author. But let me just play this song by Louisa Tunsiya, Ya Urda or Ya Warda. Ya Warda, Masoud. Let's listen for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and you tell us about the culture, if it's still there, or it disappeared from Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria. This is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. You are listening now to Louisa Tunsiya. Welcome back to True Talk. This is your host, Samar Jarrah, and you were just listening to Louisa Tunsiya. Who is she, Masoud?
Louisa Tunsiya was part of this generation of Jewish Arab singers that kind of Jewish people at the time, I guess, were free from some of the social mores of their Muslim compatriots and were better able to become cabaret singers. There's a kind of a phenomenon around the time of Louisa Tunsiya, just before my grandmother's generation and lasting until a little after it, of Jewish Tunisian women singing songs. Sometimes they're very racy songs that they're allowed to sing because they're not beholden, I think, to some of the same social mores, although this is not the truth. There was still very much a double standard for the Natiness of the good girls of our community and the girls who were allowed to sing in cabarets, or the women who were allowed, to sing in cabarets. Louisa Tunsiya is considered to be one of the greatest singers of this generation of Tunisian music. Singers like her include Habiba Masika, another Jewish Tunisian singer. This kind of culture is often forgotten in the West, but very much exists in Tunisia. If you tell many Tunisian people, at least in Tunis, the people that I've encountered, about Habiba Masika, Louisa Tunsiya, they'll know that these are Jewish Tunisian singers who are Tunisian, full stop, and part of the Tunisian canon of what makes our music great.
Can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother?
Absolutely. My grandmother, Daida, raised me in the United States, in Los Angeles, and she was originally from Tunis, from a family from a smaller coastal town called Bedier in Tunisia. Her family on one side had been a kind of a modest family that worked in olive oil production. And on another side, she came from a long line of royal government dignitaries, beylikal, to use the Ottoman Empire term, government dignitaries, some of which were more infamous than others. And regardless of the specifics, which you can read in the book, her family was one that was very much tied to Tunisia's history, that was very patriotic for Tunisia. Until today, many of my grandmother's relatives, those who are still alive, live in France. Some of them still live in Tunisia or ended up going back to Tunisia, but some of them moved to France, married French Catholic women, and never took French citizenship. And that's kind of a common occurrence among Jewish Tunisian people of that generation in France. And it really is a function of our pride in Tunisianness. Also, the Ghriba synagogue, the famous synagogue in Jarrah on an island off the coast of Tunisia, is really the centerpiece of our Judaism. For Daida's family to go on a pilgrimage to this synagogue was extremely important for very important kind of spiritual reasons. The centerpieces, the focal points of our Judaism were within the context of our nations. The important rabbis, the important spiritual leaders that we had were at home. That's why you still see a large Jewish community in Tunisia today. Is that it is not even just important to us out of patriotism, it is spiritually significant to us. And then I think I'm especially proud, even though there were moments in Tunisian history where the Jewish Tunisian communities faced violence and discrimination, that Tunisia has found a way to be home to one of the largest Arab world Jewish communities, and also continue to support the cause of Palestinian liberation as we see other nations, to include my other ancestral nation of Morocco, normalizing with Israel.
This is an this is the WMNF 88.5 FM, and we are talking to Masoud Hayyoun, the author of When We Were Arabs, the Jewish Family's Forgotten History. We have like 6 or 7 minutes, but I think your grandmother met your grandfather in France, and then they moved to Los Angeles. Was she less attached to the Arab world or the Arabness or the culture than your grandfather, or they both eventually put all their love for that part of the world in you equally?
I think for her it was difficult. I think for the reasons that I described earlier, there were specific policies within Jewish communities in both Tunisia and Egypt that drove them in different directions. Oscar was moved further by policy to re-Arabize, to watch Arabic films, to speak perfect Arabic, several dialects of Arabic, and identify more with an Egyptian and a Arab cultural and national legacy. She did identify very much. She identified to a lesser degree because of the enforced de-Arabization of Jewish Tunisian communities. But the Tunisianness of Daida was something that even over the course of generations, even with the policies as put out by Alteris and Cohen, she still ended up hearkening back to that. That was always very much who we were. It was just that it was more greatly impressed upon her community that you had to hide that if you wanted to be a bourgeois person in the imperialist world that we live in.
Tell me, Masoud, about your visits to the Arab world.
I was a reporter very briefly for, not very briefly, for several years for Al Jazeera America, and then when that closed, for Al Jazeera English. Really, it was just a job, to be honest with you. I was very happy for the opportunities that I had with Al Jazeera, and I'm very grateful to them. But because I worked for Al Jazeera, kind of ironically, my former colleagues have told me it wouldn't be safe for me to go back to Egypt at this point. I hope that that's not true. I would hope to go back to Egypt at some point, but I do think that it's ironic that a Jewish Arab guy would be kind of classed as an Islamist person because having worked for Al Jazeera. So that's ironic and a little bit funny. So I went to Egypt one time long before I worked for Al Jazeera and didn't appreciate it as much as I should have if I would have known that because I took a job with Al Jazeera, I wouldn't be able to go back as easily. So that was my one experience with Egypt. And because I had a very difficult time emotionally going there without Oscar, I didn't end up going to Alexandria or seeing his street or visiting the graves of my ancestors or any of that. I very much hope to do that in the near future.
How about I went to Tunisia? Yeah, 1 minute and a half. Yeah.
Oh, please. To Tunisia after my grandmother died. This book is about me kind of grappling with the death of my grandparents and how Arabness makes them immortal for me. So I went back to Tunisia after my grandmother died and found people who really looked like her family and who treated us like family in that tiny, magnificent, exceptional nation that's still struggling for government accountability.
I want to thank you so much, Masoud Hayyoun, the author of When We Were Arabs, a Jewish Family's Forgotten History, for being on True Talk. It was very nice of you to wake up.
It's a great honor.
To wake up this early in Los Angeles. Thank you, Masoud.
Thank you, Ms. Jarrah. Thank you.
So this ends our interview with Masoud. I hope you had enjoyed it. And I think on Twitter, for some reason, the people couldn't hear the conversation, but it is always on the archives of WMNF. You can go to WMNF.org, click on the schedule, and go to Friday and True Talk, and you will always find it there. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for supporting WMNF, and thank you for supporting True Talk. I know next month we're going to be fundraising again soon, inshallah. And let me just play a little bit of this amazing song that I played in the beginning. People liked it. Thank you so much for tuning in and for supporting WMNF. This is WMNF Tampa.
This is The Scoop for Thursday.